we looked at, general like overview of how gender is studied in economics, and some things that were not really specific to the Indian context, but more general about behavioral differences, and also how just social norms around gender have evolved over time. But for this lecture, I'm going to focus specifically on policies related to gender in India. And again, there's a lot that has been happening, but I have decided to today in the lecture talk about three sort of main domains, because there's a lot of work that is there in the literature on examining policies in politics, inheritance rights, as well as in the labor market. And I think in the reading list, I also had a paper, especially my paper on policies related to sex-selective abortion. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details on that, but I'm happy to discuss that if you like in the office hours, okay? Because there's already quite a bit here. So let's start with politics. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, if you look at the number of women in parliaments and upper houses in almost every country, it's pretty low. And that's also true in India. Women are underrepresented in almost all political positions relative to their population share. So in 1987 in India, 9% of parliament members were female. And by 2000, it had increased to about 14%. But as you can see, it's still really low. And one policy that a lot of countries have experimented with is the use of political quotas and reservations, or what we call affirmative action, to increase the number of female policymakers. Now, the question is, people typically don't like quotas, and because, they can tend to be sticky. It's not clear whether that's the right thing to do. But we'll see why, quotas may be a good thing or a bad thing in this particular context. So the idea is so it depends on whether quotas are the right policy, will depend on why do we see very few female politicians. So if the issue is that women inherently don't want to be politicians, then that's a problem that the quota is not going to solve. It's not really the issue then that, the quotas can address. But if the issue is that voters are biased against either female politicians, or voters think that female politicians are not good, then that's something that quotas can help, right? So let's think about why that is. So if, let's say, voters somehow think that women are very bad leaders, right? Now, whether it could be a correct assessment that maybe women are not very good as political leaders, or it could be that they have never really experienced a political leader who's female, and so they think that women are going to be not very good, right? So a very good example of this is the US context. So there's never been a female president. And if you ask people, do you think a female will be a good president? Then they might say no. But then if you ask them, on what basis do you know? Because you've never experienced a female president, right? So if people hold these very strong beliefs which say that women cannot be good leaders, and they do not experience good leaders, female leaders, then there is no way for them to update their beliefs. So quotas help in that sense, that you're sort of forcing voters to experience a female leader. And maybe women are actually very bad leaders, which they will learn. And they will say, look, we already knew this. Or it could be that they will learn that female leaders are maybe the same as male leaders. And then next time when there is a female politician running for office, they may not be as biased. Right? So quotas can do many different things. One of them being that it tries to address the bias based on no information. Okay, so that's what they do. So the other question is why people think quotas are important is, if that's the only way you can have a female politician get elected, then voters are going to experience that maybe female leaders are different, right? Maybe female leaders enact policies, and one reason why people say we want to do that is because female leaders make policies that are better for women. But we don't know whether that's the case, right? If you elect a female leader in, let's say, UP, Mayawati was a chief minister, or Jayalalitha, or Mamata Banerjee, do these female politicians enact different policies than their male counterparts? And do these policies benefit women more than men? Right? So we don't know, right? So somebody has to really do research on it. So the first paper that we're going to talk about is trying to address this question. What is the effect of female politicians on policy decisions? And the finding is that it does make a difference, right? Having a female politician changes outcomes from if we had a male leader, right? And so this was done in the context of the panchayat system. So all of you know that through the amendment in 1992 in India, now 1/3 of all seats in gram panchayats are reserved for women, right? So 1/3 of all seats as well as 1/3 of all head positions. So these will be sarpanch or pradhan or whatever you call it, right? So they are all, they have to be female. And what the paper does is it compares how public goods are spent in GPs just as gram panchayat, in panchayats that are reserved versus that are unreserved. And the good thing about the Indian experiment, and in fact, most of the work on the effect of quotas in gender space comes from India, because the Indian system has a cool feature that which GP gets reserved is random, right? So there's always a list on which you randomly pick whether this particular GP is going to get a reservation for. I think they first do it by caste, and then within each caste group, the reservation goes for women. And so what this paper did was they do the data collection and analysis in two places. So one is West Bengal and the Birbhum district in West Bengal, and the second is Udaipur in Rajasthan. So we know West Bengal and Rajasthan are very different. One is in the east, one is in the sort of west of India. One is, they have very different sort of economic status. They are very different in terms of their political status. They're different in terms of even gender gaps. So it's nice because if we only did this in West Bengal, we would think, are these results generalizable? If we only did it in Rajasthan, we'll be like, does it apply to places like Karnataka? So of course, it's ideal if we do this for the whole country, but at least this is better than having only, one state. So in West Bengal, so we all know that the panchayat system did not start when the law was enacted, right? Before the 70s, so panchayats have been in operation for a long time in India, even before the law. And in West Bengal, they have been in operation since 1978, and in Rajasthan since 1995. So how the system operates could be very different. In both states, gram panchayats can spend money on local infrastructure, so they can invest in roads, schools, water, irrigation, and things like that. And in West Bengal, they're also allowed to run their own informal schools, which is not the case in Rajasthan. So if you look at what happens with reservation, does it even work, right? So in many cases in India, when there is a law, doesn't mean it is actually enacted. So we don't know a priori whether the reservation system works or not, right? Is it implemented how it is supposed to be implemented? So this table tells you it is. So if you look at reserved gram panchayats, and in West Bengal and Rajasthan, you see that 100% of pradhans were female, right? That means the reservation system is implemented as it is supposed to be. But what's also interesting is when there is no reservation, only 6.5% of pradhans are female in West Bengal and only 1.7% in Rajasthan. That means in the absence of reservation, very few women are actually getting elected as sarpanch. Okay, so what they're going to compare is outcomes in these two different types of places. So I think everybody, I've got a sense of who is in the lecture today, and I feel different people, not everyone may be aware of the theoretical literature or, have the same sort of background. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. If you're interested, you can read the paper and then, discuss with me in the office hours, but I'll just give you a general sense of what the paper does. So the paper tries to understand theoretically what we should expect. So let's say there is reservation. Let's say there are females who are getting elected now because of the law. Do we expect a priori that women should enact different policies? And if so, why? Right? So if you were a politician, forget about male, female. If I were to think about why a politician does what he or she does, we think the politicians mainly do it because they want to get re-elected, right? So that's one motivation they have. Right? So if Donald Trump is enacting certain policies now, or if there's an election coming up, we see in India a lot of chief ministers starts giving out a lot of, carrots. We know they're doing it because they want to get re-elected. Right? So one big motivation for politicians to do what they do is to get re-elected. So if both females and males want to get re-elected, then the things that they should be the same, which gets them re-elected. Right? So we don't really think that men and women should do different things if the people who are going to vote for them remain the same, right? So there should be no gender difference if that's the only thing that's going on. The second thing why politicians do different things, but we also know that not all politicians in India do the same thing, right? So some politicians may do things that benefit their caste. Some politicians may do things that benefit their religion. So So the same may be true for gender, right? And the reason for that would be because they think that the vote base that they have is from that group. So if female politicians think their vote base is females, and if male politicians think their great vote base is males, then it could be female politicians will do different things because they want women's vote, whereas male politicians don't care, so they don't do those things. So that could be a second reason. The third thing could be politicians do things because they want to do what they like, right? So maybe Donald Trump wants to do things not because he thinks it's good for the country, not because it is what the voters want. He just thinks he wants to do something and he does it, right? And that may be true for a lot of politicians everywhere, right? Some of the things they do are things that they want. So maybe a female politician will also do this, and she will implement policies that she likes, right? And it could be that what I like if I am a female politician is similar to what other women in my constituency like. But I'm not doing it because I care about my constituency or I care about women. It could be that I'm doing it because I like it, right? So we may see differences in what women and men do when they become sarpanch, but the reasons for why they do things can be very different. Right? So we want to find out, first of all, do men and women do different policies when they are elected? And second, if there is a difference, why is that females do different policies than men? Okay, so this model is sort of trying to sort it out. So what it does is it basically studies, there's a very seminal model in political economy called the citizens candidate model. It understands how people make the decision to run for office. So basically politicians are also citizens, right? So the politician's decision is, should I become a political candidate or should I just stay a citizen and vote? That's my sort of choice set. So if I become a candidate, in deciding that, I have to compare the cost of running for office with the probability of being elected. So if I think nobody is going to vote for me and running for office is costly, then I should not run, right? There's no point. But if I think I have a very high chance of getting elected and there's a particular cost of running for office that I can afford, then maybe I want to run because I feel I can then benefit from becoming a politician. So basically everybody sort of makes that decision. So citizens decide whether to run or not. Citizens then elect a candidate, and then the candidate will implement some policies. That's a 3-stage of a game. Now, what you can do once you get elected can be many things, right? So in this model, you think that the choice set is between 0 and 1. So a politician can pick anything between 0 and 1. Okay? That's their policy decision. And every individual has a preferred policy. So I may want to implement policy 0.5. I may want to implement policy 1.9. Right? So different people may have different preferences. And we assume that men and women have different preferences. Right? So a female politician may pick 0.1, whereas a male politician may pick 0.8. Right? And so they have different sort of spaces. And in fact, here the assumption is women pick between 0 and W, and men pick between M and 1. Okay, so men are to the right of women, and right is just like just an assumption. It could be right of anything, right? And W and M, W may be less than M, so that means greater than M, which means there is some overlap between their policy preferences. Cost of running can also be different, and they assume that women have a higher cost of running, right? Which makes sense because maybe women face opposition from their family. Maybe women don't have any political connections, so they really have to invest their own money. Maybe the society doesn't like women who run for office. So for whatever reason, the cost of running for office is higher for women than for men. Okay? And then what is the benefit to a person I if a particular policy is implemented? It depends on how different it is from the preference. So if I am not a candidate, I am just a regular voter, how much do I benefit from this policy that is implemented? It depends on the difference between, so if I get elected and I'm politician I, I'm going to implement WI because that's omega I, because that's what I like, right? So the implemented policy is WI and I am a voter who prefers XJ, then the benefit to me is the difference between the two. Okay, if I like 0.1 and the politician is implementing 0.8, then the difference is sort of how much I lose. Okay? And if I am a candidate, then it depends on what is implemented and the difference between what is implemented, what I like, and how much cost I have incurred to run. Okay, so the net benefit. So what the model, when you solve it, tells you is that ultimately what gets implemented is a weighted policy. So the candidate is going to weight. So why wouldn't a candidate always implement their own preferred policy? It's because the candidate also wants to get re-elected, right? So if I was, and that's why people who have term limits, if this is the last term when I can run for office, I never have to run again, I can do whatever I want. But if I'm going to run for office again next year, then I'm going to take into account whether people are likely to vote for me again or not if I implement this policy. So I may face a trade-off between what I want, what I like, and what will get me elected, right? So the model says, if you are going to run for office again, you're going to have a weighted average. You don't want to only do what the voters want, but you also don't want to only do what you want, right? So you pick something which is an average. So you weigh your own preferences with the preferences of the voters. Now notice here whose preferences matter, which voters' preferences matter. So what this model says is it's the elite whose preferences matter, right? So a politician doesn't just care about every voter's preference. The politician cares only about the elites in the community. This could be upper caste people, it could be more educated people. In this case, it could be men, right? So if most of the voting is influenced by men's preferences, maybe the wives just vote what their husbands do, right? Or women just vote based on what the male family members do, then it doesn't matter what women really want, right? Then the preferences of voters means preferences of people who are the pro-male people, right? And so you are more likely to then select a pro-male policy because that's your voting base. And then you find there's a median voter and so on. So what this looks like too much math for some of you probably. Don't worry about that. What this is simply trying to show you is that once you have a reservation, what does it do to the outcome that a politician will implement? What it's saying is that a man could also implement a pro-female outcome, and a woman could also implement a pro-man outcome, right? But what it's saying is that if for certain assumptions, so remember, women are to the left and the men are to the right in the 0 to 1 space, right? We have assumed that. So the most pro-male outcome that a woman is going to implement, okay, is going to be to the left of the most pro-man outcome that a woman is going to implement. Okay, so read that again. So the most pro-woman outcome that a man is going to implement is to the right of the most pro-man outcome a woman will implement. That means there is an overlap. This is all that it's saying, is that there is some overlap in what the men and the female politicians will do. It's not completely separate. Okay, so there's some overlap. The second is, a woman will never implement a very left-wing policy. And left-wing is not really left-wing in how we think of it in the political sense of left versus right. It could be, but in this case, it simply means because women's policies are to the left in the 0 to 1 interval and men's are to the right, a woman is never just going to implement 0, for example, right? And a man is never going to implement 1. Why? Because the woman also cares about getting re-elected. Okay, so if she cares about getting re-elected, she is also going to put emphasis on the voters' preferences. And in this case, the voters happen to be pro-male, right? That's an assumption. So she is going to also implement a policy, might be to the right of what she wants, right? And what reservation does is it allows a counter to the influence of this elites. For a male politician, he wants a right-wing policy because he likes a right-wing policy. And his voters who are pro-male also want a right-wing policy. So the policy that gets implemented is a right-wing policy. Now, if you have a female politician, she also cares about her voters who want a right-wing policy, but she herself wants a left-wing policy. So her choice will be somewhere to the left of what the male would have picked. Right? That's what this is trying to get at. All right. So what this means is that there should be different policies in reserved and unreserved GPs. Why? Because the female wants a different policy than the male. And outcomes are going to be closer to women's preferences in reserved GPs, right? Because it's going to be more left-wing, and we know all women are on the left side of the spectrum. But this doesn't mean that the reason why we are getting a left-wing policy is because the politician cares about females. No, the politician is still catering to the pro-male voters. It's simply that she herself wants more. She herself has different preferences, right? So the reason the outcome is moving to the left is not because of the voters. It's only moving to the left because the politician herself wants a left-wing policy. Okay. All right. So how do we measure preferences? How do we know what voters want? So it's very difficult to do that. What they try to do in this paper is they capture data on whether people have complained about things or not, right? So if I really care about my children's education and I really care about how good my school is in the village, and if the school is performing well or not performing well, then I'm more likely to go and file complaints or file requests about it, right? If I really care about whether the hand pump in the village is working or not because I have to go fill water, and if it's not working, then I'm more likely to go and complain about it. So they assume that people's preferences are correlated with how they act. If I go and approach the Pradhan about point X, then that means I must care about X more than something else, right? So they collected data on formal requests and complaints to the Pradhan for every person in the data in their study villages. And they then divided this by gender, right? So DI, now remember this will get complicated later. I will try to simplify it. DI is simply the difference between women's and men's preferences. Okay. So this is the share of requests for women for issue I. And this is the share of N, small n by capital N. This is the share of requests for issue I from men. Okay. So this is simply saying whether if DI is higher, that means women care more about that issue. Whereas if DI is lower, that means men care more about that issue. Okay. SI is the average. It's not the difference. This is just saying how much a particular issue is valued in that population by both men and women. Okay. So do you see the difference? One is capturing, do men care more about drinking water than women? And the second is saying, is drinking water a big issue in this village for everyone on average? Okay. So if now you can immediately see how this will become relevant. If women care more about female issues, then they should be responding more to DI than SI, right? But if women also, as in by women I mean female leaders, if they care about just getting re-elected, then they should mainly care about SI, because it doesn't matter, whether it's a female issue or not, they just want to get re-elected. So this, we won't go into much in detail, but this is simply a whenever you do a randomized experiment or there is a, treatment versus control group, you want to make sure that they are very similar, right? So this is comparing reserved GPs with unreserved GPs in West Bengal and Rajasthan to see if they are significantly different from each other on other dimensions. So for example, somebody brought about the number of voters, right? Male voters. If reserved GPs had fewer male voters than unreserved GPs, then we would say that the outcomes are different, maybe because of that. Right? So what we want to make sure is that these two places are very similar. So what they do is, along a lot of different outcomes of variables, they see whether the difference is statistically significant or not. Right? So for both Rajasthan and West Bengal, they basically show that they are not significantly different, at least across these dimensions that they were able to measure. Okay, so they're very similar in terms of population, female literacy rate, male literacy rate, and so on. Okay, so that's good. Now what do? So first, they want to estimate the effect of a GP being reserved rather than not reserved in a system where there is reservation. This is important, right? So they're not saying what would happen if there was no reservation and suddenly you get a reservation, right? Here, even the unreserved GPs know that maybe they will get a reservation at some point. It's just that they haven't gotten it this year, right? So we don't know if voters would behave differently or leaders would behave differently when there is no reservation in other places. So this is a system which has reservation, and some places were selected for reservation this term, this election cycle, and others were not. Okay. So what do? First, they will regress the outcome is investment in good I. So good could be drinking water, it could be roads, irrigation, schools, something in Gram Panchayat J. Okay, so that's the I in J. We regress it on whether the Gram Panchayat has a reservation. So RJ is 1 if it is reserved, 0 if it's not reserved. And we are going to interact this with DI. So DI is the average difference between the fraction of requests between women. So if DI is higher, that means in this, for this particular issue, women care more about it than men. Okay, and then when DI is lower. And in the next, they interacted with SI. This is simply saying that issue I is more preferred by this constituency or not. Okay, and then we want to see what the effect is. So what do we expect the effect of the sign of beta 2 and beta 5? So beta 2 and beta 5 is simply asking, when there is no difference between these D and S, is there any effect of reservation? And beta 3 is saying, if there is a reservation, is the effect different if DI is different, right? So if DI is higher, right, a positive DI means women prefer the issue, then we think beta 3 should be positive, right? A female politician may implement a more female issue when she's elected due to reservation. Okay. Beta 6 should also be positive because we are saying that these are her voters. Her constituency likes SI. So the politician should invest in SI because she wants to get re-elected, right? So these two maybe both are positive. But then the next issue is, are female chiefs doing it because they like that policy, or is it because they care about their female voters? Okay. So what we now do is, instead of just defining DI, so we have defined DI as this. Remember, there is no J subscript in both of these. What is J? J is the panchayat. This is for everybody, not in their state. This is in whole of West Bengal and whole of Rajasthan. This is not about your own panchayat. So what they do next is define these by your own panchayat. Okay, so DIJ and SIJ. So we are basically saying this is the difference between male and female preferences on issue I in Panchayat J. This is the average preference of male and female voters on issue I in Panchayat J. So now your own Gram Panchayat, and this is in general. So if the female voter cares about her own constituency because she wants to get re-elected, then we should think that these J's should matter more than DI and SI. But if she is implementing a female policy because she is herself a female, then the DI is more relevant because that's for in general, right? It's not specific to her particular constituency. So they're going to compare whether when you interact RJ with DI versus when you interact RJ with DIJ, which one is more significant. Okay. We expect B10 to be 0 and B11 to be 0 if the policy affects only through your own preferences rather than differential performance to other complaints. So if DIJ is 0, it means you don't particularly care about your own female constituency, right? You only care about something because, let's say DI is not, beta 9 is not 0, but beta 10 is 0. What this tells us is that you don't care about your female constituents, but you care about female issues. Okay, so what happens, right? So this is just a means table, but since it's a randomized experiment, this is basically what we should find. So they do it separately for West Bengal and Rajasthan because they are different. And what you see is that first, they want to see whether reservation affects women's political participation. Now remember, the outcomes are being measured in terms of requests. So does the number of requests change? First of all, right? Maybe women feel more able to go complain about issues when they have a female pradhan. Whereas if there was a male pradhan, they felt, oh, I can't go and complain to the male pradhan, right? So they want to see if something like that has happened. Whereas for men, maybe men are more likely to go complain to a female pradhan because they don't like her. Right? So they go on to make her life more difficult. So they want to see whether something like that happened or not. So let's see first West Bengal. The fraction of women among participants in the Gram Sansad increased, right? So it did go up. in reserved GPs relative to unreserved GPs, right? I think it's possibly marginally significant. There was an increase in the likelihood that females filed a complaint to the GP, but there was no change in men filing a complaint. Okay, so it seems like in West Bengal, having a female pradhan increased women's participation. These are voters. Okay, so the general constituency's participation increased. That's not the case in Rajasthan. If anything, I mean, this is negative, but it's insignificant. It's almost zero. So there was no effect of having a female pradhan on women's participation in the Gram Sansad. There is no change in the effect on women filing a complaint, right? And if anything, there was an increase in the likelihood of men filing a complaint, right? So you can already see that the same policy can have very different effects depending on which state we look at. Okay, that's one. Now, what do people's preferences look like? Okay, so let me expand this slightly so that you can see it clearly. So this is now issues raised by men and women in the last 6 months on some different dimensions. So first of all, they look at public works, welfare programs, childcare, health, credit or employment. This is for women, then men, reserved versus unreserved. Okay, this is for West Bengal and Rajasthan. So this table has a lot of information. So I'm not going to go into a lot of stuff, but let me just point out a few things. So first of all, if we look at average, this is the average of men and women. What issue is the most important? Public works. Okay, most complaints are about public works. That is also true in Rajasthan, 0.74 versus this. So for both states, most issues are about public works. Okay, this could be things like, food for work program or something like that. Okay. Now let's look at men versus women. The difference is the difference between men and women. So minus would mean men prefer something and plus would mean women prefer something. Okay. If you now look at public works, it's a much more of a male issue in Rajasthan than it is in West Bengal. Okay, it's much more negative in West Bengal than in Rajasthan. But if you look at credit or employment, it's a much more of a male issue in West Bengal than it is in Rajasthan. Right? Welfare programs are also more of a female issue in West Bengal because it's 0.16 versus 0.06. So that means West Bengal and Rajasthan have different gender preferences. Now within public works, so they then break down public works because this is the biggest chunk in both states. They split it into drinking water, road improvement, housing, electricity, irrigation, education, and so on. Now look at on average, right? Two big issues in West Bengal are drinking water and road improvement, followed by irrigation. In Rajasthan, the biggest issue is drinking water, which is not surprising, followed by other, and the third is road improvement. Okay, so you already see there's a difference in average preferences. Now let's look at male and female. In West Bengal, drinking water is 0.13 a female issue. Right? In Rajasthan also it is a female issue, but less so. But look at the sign on road, it's reversed, right? In Rajasthan, roads is a male issue because it's negative, whereas in West Bengal, Rajasthan is in West Bengal, roads is a female issue. Right? And this is consistent with what you see because there's a lot more maybe need for migration through roads for Rajasthan men than for West Bengal men. Okay, they migrate to neighboring regions via road for work, whereas maybe in West Bengal that's not the case, or less. It is less of a case. Let's look at irrigation. Irrigation is a more male issue in West Bengal, whereas it is not so. It's much smaller in Rajasthan. Right. So what they are going to see is if females and males in Rajasthan and West Bengal have different preferences, when West Bengal and Rajasthan get female pradhans, what do they invest in? So we should expect a female pradhan in Rajasthan to invest less in roads, right? Because that's less of an issue. Whereas we will expect a female pradhan in West Bengal to invest more in drinking water and less in irrigation. Right? So we should see these differences if they are responding to preferences. Okay, let's see whether that is the case. So this is West Bengal now, and this difference is between the reserve GPs and non-reserve GPs. So we see there is a significant increase in the number of drinking water facilities that are built or repaired in West Bengal when a female is elected. Okay, that is consistent with drinking water being a very female issue in West Bengal. Okay, it is a smaller, it's 0.09, so you should see less increase in Rajasthan, and we see that it increases but by less. Okay, so female pradhans are responding to issues that are more female. Okay, let's look at roads. In West Bengal, females are investing in 0.18, okay, but not in Rajasthan. So there's a difference, right? Here, let's look. In Rajasthan, sorry, which one? West Bengal, road was also a female issue, but it was not a female issue in Rajasthan. So we see exactly that female pradhans do not invest in road in Rajasthan, but they increase investment in West Bengal, where it was a female issue, right? So it seems that female pradhans are investing more in public goods that are preferred by females. Okay. Now, is this because of their own female voters, or is it because it's a general female issue? So that we can look at the interaction between DI and DIJ, because DIJ is your own village specific, and DI is whether in general it's a female issue in Rajasthan or West Bengal, right? What do you see in West Bengal? So now the outcome is not for particular public good. This is a standardization. Okay, you can read it in the notes. The dependent variable is a standardized measure of investment. So they basically standardize all the goods, 6 types of public goods. What you find now is this is telling you the response to female liking something in general, and this is telling you the response to female liking in your constituency. So now let's look at column 3, because that's where both are included. What you see is that a female pradhan is not significantly increasing investment if DIJ is higher. This is insignificant, but this is significant. She is increasing and DI is higher, right? This is also true for Rajasthan. DI interaction with reservation is highly significant and positive, but not reservation with DIJ. This is telling us DI matters. Whether something is a female issue does matter to a female politician, but not whether it is a female issue in her constituency per se. Okay, that means she's investing more in roads or irrigation or water or whatever because she cares about it. It's more likely that she cares about it because she is a female, so she's investing in it, but not because females in her own constituency want and they will vote for her. It's less likely to be the case. Okay. And then they try to do a lot of robustness checks to figure out, if something else could be driving this, but they rule out all those criteria. Okay. So I don't want to go much more into the details of the paper. There's a lot of detail, but what basically the conclusion is: 1, female leaders, sarpanches do invest in different public goods, right? And they invest in different goods depending on the preferences of their voters and preferences of their own. And female voters, female leaders' investments are closer to female voters' preferences, but only because the leader herself is female, not because she's voting because she's doing it for her constituents' benefit. Okay, so that's basically what the conclusion of this. So this is the last thing I want to discuss on the issue of quota. So remember, one justification was for quotas was that people may be biased against female politicians, and there is no way for them to update their beliefs because they have never experienced a female politician, right? So we saw in the absence of quotas, only 1% of GPs are actually electing any women in Rajasthan, right? And 6.5 in West Bengal. So how will voters, if they are biased, how will they correct their bias, right? So then the question is, okay, fine, you have invested these, you've designed these quotas. Does being exposed to female politicians reduce bias? Right? Now that people in West Bengal and Rajasthan are being forced to have a female sarpanch, do they now think that female sarpanch are as bad as they thought before? Or do they now like female sarpanch? Or do they think they're as good or as bad as male sarpanch? So that's what they want to test. So what they do was, this paper was only based on the data in Birbhum. I think they did not collect this data from Rajasthan. So it's obviously not representative of the whole country, but it's still interesting because you want to see what at least happens in Rajasthan, in West Bengal. So what they do is, okay, this is just the details of this, of the reservation status. So what happens is, as I mentioned before, first, the reservation is for castes. Okay, so as we know, there is reservation for SCs and STs in India for Gram Panchayats. So first they do the reservation for caste, and then within the caste groups, they reserve for male versus female. So sometimes what happens, so you will never have a GP that's reserved for scheduled castes and tribes in 2 consecutive elections. So if today in this election cycle, my Gram Panchayat is reserved for scheduled caste, next time it will not be, right? That's a guarantee because they rotate. But since they're doing the male-female split within group, it's possible that in this election cycle, I am reserved for scheduled caste, and I get also reserved for women. And in the next election cycle, I get not reserved for caste, so it's up and it's free for any caste, but then I again get selected for female. Right? So you can have some GPs that will be female-female reservation twice in a row. Okay, and then some will be female this year, not female next year, and so on. So what they want to do is, so, and then there will be also some GPs that do not have reservation in 3 years for females. Okay, they want to compare whether voters behave differently if they have experienced a female reservation once versus twice versus never. Okay, so people who have experienced a female GP reservation twice have been exposed to a female pradhan for 10 years because each cycle is 5 years, right? And for the same 10 years, some GPs would have had no female pradhan, and some GPs would have had female pradhan for 5 years. So they want to see, once that reservation goes, do people vote differently when there is no reservation, depending on how much reservation they had in the past. Okay, all right. So let's go in the interest of time to see. So they have reservation balance because it's a random lottery. This is sort of what they find. Okay, they do it for 2. So the 2 election cycles are 1998, then 2003, 5 years apart. Okay, this is the fraction of female pradhans. In 1998, 40% selected women, and 40% had women, and in 2003, slightly 0.42 or something, 0.5 is female. This is GPs that were never reserved for women. So they have never had any reservation. You see that the selection of women is really low. Okay, it was even lower in 1998, 2003 it increases a bit, but it's like less than 20%. Now look at this. So these GPs had a reservation in 1998. And obviously then it is 100%. Okay. And then in 2003, they did not have a reservation. It went down. Okay. This is GP that did not have a reservation in 2003, and then it went up. Then they were reserved. It went to 100. And then this is when you have both reservations. Okay. Sorry, this is not the outcome. This is simply showing you how it worked. So women are being elected more when they are, obviously when there is reservation. Okay. This is now the electoral outcomes. So 98 and 2003 are the 2 terms where you have some reservation. 2008, now they're looking at GPs which do not have a reservation. Okay, so in 2008, they look at the subsample of panchayats which do not have reservation. Maybe they had in the past, but right now they don't, because, and some other GPs have, but they don't, right? So let's say there are these 15 GPs that did not get reservation by lottery. These are the ones which have never had a reservation in 98, 2003, and now. Okay, what do you see? And then the 3 bars are Pradhan, candidate for ward councillor, winners of ward council seat. This is telling you, let's just look at the first one because we are caring about Pradhans for now. In these places, about 9% of Pradhans elected are female. Okay, when there is no reservation in the last 10 years. Okay, and there is no reservation now. These are the panchayats where they have reservation once, either in 98 or 2003. So for 5 years, these people had a female pradhan. but now they don't have reservation. And look, they are now likely to elect a female pradhan 13%, right? So there is an increase here. So having a pradhan once increases your likelihood of electing a female even when there is no reservation. Now look at this, right? This is when there was a reservation in 98 and 2003, but now there is no reservation in 2008. They are likely to elect a female pradhan 17%. Okay, so it's not gone up to 100%. It's not that suddenly these people only like female pradhans. That's not the case. Majority are still selecting males, right? 83% are still selecting males. But there is an increase in the likelihood that a female gets elected without reservation if people have experienced a female pradhan in the past. This tells us that being exposed to female pradhans through the quotas does change people's likelihood of electing a female. Right? Maybe they now think women are not that bad, right? Or maybe they think women are actually better, or whatever, right? Something is clearly changing because of these quotas. Okay, so that's the main result of the paper. So I will skip, these details. It's basically just going to do the same thing that is in this figure. They're going to do it through numbers. Okay, they'll see the same thing. Now the important thing is, why do we see this, right? So one could be that once you've had quotas, maybe voters don't elect female politicians because no females run for office, right? In India, there might be a stigma about women running for office. If women don't even work outside the home, it's less likely that they'll go stand for election. So, but now that there have been 2 years, 10 years of quotas, at least some women have gotten experience, right? Some women have now become experienced politicians, and maybe they can act as role models or mentors for other women who want to become politicians, right? So maybe now there are more politicians running for office, and that's why they're more likely to get elected. That's one channel. The second is networking effect, right? If anyone has any experience, we all probably know, becoming a politician, you can't just stand on your own and become elected, right? You need to be in a network. You need to know other politicians. You need to have a affiliation maybe with the political party. You need somebody to fund, raise for you, and so on. Maybe women don't win because they don't have political networks. So maybe once you have reservations, it increases women's networks, right? It could be that women implement different policies and voters like that, right? Maybe the last pradhan we had, she solved the drinking water problem in our village, and everybody is now very happy with that, and they now vote for, they think, oh, women do good work, so they vote for that, right? Maybe that's what they did. Or people's attitudes towards leaders may change. If they now realize that maybe women are not as bad. So maybe if Hillary Clinton had gotten elected in the US, people would have realized maybe she's okay, she's as good or bad as any other male president. And the next time a female ran for office, she may have been more likely to get elected, right? Because people change their attitudes. So this paper only focuses on the last one. Do people change their attitudes towards female leaders? And they do it in very interesting ways. So they're not looking at whether they actually voted for somebody, because that we know they did, but they ask these other questions, right? So they ask, how would you rank the effectiveness of the current chief, right? Does it vary by male or female? So in fact, people don't think that female pradhans are that much better. So they don't think, in this table, they do not find any significant change in whether voters suddenly think, the women are better leaders or not. They don't. Okay. But they do think that they are slightly, so if you look at observable difference, they do not drive any any of this. So it's not that women provide more public goods, none of that, none of these things are basically significant. But it does seem to be the case that implicit bias goes down. Okay, so they did this in this hypothetical way. So they created a speech. Okay, it's the same speech. They made a female read the speech, and they made a male read the speech. They recorded it, and then in a village meeting, they played that speech for the people, right? And they asked them to rate. Do you think this person will be a good pradhan? Just by listening to the speech. Okay, so if people are biased against women, they will think, oh no, it's the same speech, because it's the same speech that they have experimentally asked people to read. they will say, no, the female will be a worse leader than the male just because they are biased, right? And second, what they did was a vignette. So they told people about a situation. They said, look, there is this limited money. This leader has to choose either to invest in drinking water or irrigation. And they again, described, one is a female sarpanch, she did this. One is a male sarpanch, he did this. Who do you think acted better? Right? Who do you support? So they asked that. And in both these dimensions, what they found was that both in speech, both in vignette, people who had been exposed to a female pradhan in the past due to reservations were less likely to be biased against the female voice or the female hypothetical example than voters that had been not exposed to female pradhans. Okay, so this tells us that even though they don't think that female pradhans are, somehow that magically better, there is some change in people's implicit bias, and that may be driving why, when there is no reservation, more women do get selected. Okay. The second thing they did was this implicit association test. So maybe some of you know this. If you go online, you can actually take this test yourself. So what they do is, so it's trying to get rid of political correctness. If I ask you now, do you think men are better leaders than women? We will probably say no, but that may be because you genuinely believe that, or it could be because you know what to say, because you are being politically correct, right? This test tries to get at the true sort of bias. So the way it does is, it will show you different images. Let's say they're trying to measure gender, right, and performance. They will show you some pictures on the left hand side and some pictures on the right hand side, and you have to match. Okay, and they may show you stereotypical things. So they may show you a female and then show a mother, right? They may show you a female, somebody who's teaching in a school. Somebody show a female, somebody who's doing housework, right? These are stereotypical female things, and then they might show you a male who is a policeman, a male who is a farmer, or something like that. And then they will in between also show you contradictory images. So they will show you a female but a female policeman. They'll show you a male but a male nurse, right? And you have to match. So the idea is that if something is against your stereotype, it takes you longer to match, right? If it is against your political correctness, it will take you longer to match. So just split second how much time you take to match things that are consistent with your implicit bias, it will take you less time, right? And then you can see who is biased in what way, just by using that time. So they made these people take those tests, and so something like this, a male with the parliament and a female with the hut in the village, and then you have a name or something like that, who's Ashok, or things like that, they'll make you play. And what they found was, again, that this implicit bias changed a bit. And what is interesting is, it changed only for men and not for women, right? Women did not change because maybe they were not that biased, but for men it changed much more. Okay, and the effect is much stronger for people who have been experienced a female leader twice because of consecutive reservations. Okay, so the conclusion is, so they find, first of all, that Indian villagers prefer male leaders and have negatively biased priors on the effectiveness of male leaders. The reservation does not make male villagers more sympathetic to female leaders. If you ask them, do you want a female leader, they may still say no. Okay, so they are saying explicitly, they're saying no, we don't want. But if you look at whether people are being voted, who they are voting for, and if you make them take these implicit tests and hypothetical rating of a female speech versus a male speech, you see that their implicit bias is actually decreasing. Okay, and the second generation of female pradhans in fact benefit much more than the first generation. Okay, all right. So in the interest of time, let's move on and let's quickly discuss two papers on inheritance rights in India. So, I picked this because this is another big policy change that has happened in recent years in India, and there is a fair amount of, work that has happened on the understanding the implications of that. So, forever in India, inheritance rights have varied by religion, right? So, in case of Hindus, it was just determined by Hindu Succession Act of 1956, and which applied to Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs, but not to other religions. And under this act, if a father had a will, then you can write whatever you want. You can give all your property to only the boy, only the girl, or to whichever way you want, right? So everybody is free to write a will and do whichever way they want. So that's not what the law says. The law only applies when there is no will, right? So when somebody dies intestate, which means you don't have a will, in that case, the law said that only sons get the inheritance for the joint family property or the ancestral property, and daughters did not. That was the law until 2005. Okay. But if the father on his own had bought some land or created property, that was divided equally between boys and girls, sons and daughters, right? So this was the default. And most of the land, as we know in India, is ancestral rather than personally procured. This meant that most of the land was given to sons and not to daughters. Okay, especially because a lot of people died without having a will, or even if they made a will, it's unlikely that they gave much to daughters. Okay, so this was leading to a huge inheritance gender gap. But some states in India amended their inheritance rights before others. So these are the 5 states that before the 2005 amendment, and as you can see, all of them were in the south of India, they made their inheritance rights equal for gender. Okay, so Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala was first, then Andhra Pradesh, then Tamil Nadu, then Maharashtra, then Karnataka. Okay, so what these papers, the next 2 papers that I am going to talk about, will look at is the changes in these states versus the other states in religions, Hindus versus others, right? Because this law was only amended in the Hindu Succession Act. So it did not affect, let's say, what happens to Christians or what happens to Muslims, right? Muslim women. Their outcomes should not have changed. And they should not have changed in states where there was no amendment. Okay. After 2005, everybody had the change. So you cannot really examine the impact of that law in such a, good way. Okay. So what was the law? The law said that if a woman was unmarried when the reform was passed, they were now treated equally. Okay. But if you had been married by then you did not benefit from the law. Okay. So that was the way in which it changed. And so what they do, so the first paper, this is by Klaus Denninger and his co-authors, what they do is they compare women and men whose fathers died before versus after the amendment of the act. So if somebody's father died before, they did not benefit, right? Because already that the distribution was to sons. But if they died after, then they should have received equal property. And they compare states which had the reform versus not. So it's sort of like a difference in difference estimation. Okay, what do they find? So this is basically the regression equation. So you're going to look at outcome of a person, a child of gender G, so you could be a male or a female, born in year K in household J, and you regress that. So this could be education, this could be various things. We are going to regress this on this female dummy, whether the child is a female or not, interacted with whether the father died before or after the amendment. Okay, and then we are going to interact this with other things like whether, what is the caste, what is the father's characteristic, how much land do you have, and so on. Okay, they have household fixed effects, so you can compare brothers and sisters within the same household, and you control for gender specific year of birth effects, because maybe over time women are getting, so let's say we are looking at the effect on education. Anyway, education is increasing over time for women in India, right? So you want to control for trends. So this is basically flexibly controlling for time trends by gender. Okay, what do you find? So first of all, they compare Hindus versus non-Hindus. Okay, and this is the double interaction. So for women whose father died after the amendment. Okay, so remember, after the amendment, inheritance rights became equalized. And so they're looking at the effect on whether women inherited any land. Okay, so this coefficient tells us there was a 14% increase 14 percentage point increase in the likelihood that a female inherited land after her father's death if the father died after the amendment. Okay, in Hindus relative to before. So it did not increase 100%, right? Clearly, because many people may have written a will, because now they know if I die without a will, then my daughter is also going to get. So if I want to make sure that all my land goes to my son, I may be more likely to write a will, right? But we do see that there is a significant and a substantial increase in the inheritance of land by women. Okay. Before the amendment, you see, women were much less likely to inherit land than men. If you look at non-Hindus, nothing happened. So even in non-Hindus, women are less likely to inherit land before these reform. But after this reform, HSA reform happened, nothing happened to other religions because the law did not apply to those religions. Okay, so this is causal evidence. Now, if you look at this, which daughters benefited, right? So if you look at daughters who were 1 to 6 years old, they didn't really get much. Only these, sorry, no, this is like how soon did the law have an impact? So this is within the first 6 years of the reform, not much happened, right? So this is basically if Kerala passed its law in 1976, they're looking at the first 6 years, right? So until 1982, nothing much happened. But after that, it increased. So this is before the law, nothing was going on. The first 5 years, sorry, this is a 10% increase. And then after 6 years, it increased even more. Okay, so this is actually easily seen here. This is when the law is passed. Okay, they scaled it, standardized it. So 0 could be 1976 for Kerala, 19 whatever for different years for different states, right? But what you see is the likelihood that a female inherits increases over time. Okay, is this clear to everyone? Any questions about this? It's not increasing 100%, but it is going up substantially. So that means the inheritance right reform did increase land ownership for Hindu women in these states relative to other women. Okay. Now, what happened to generation 2? So they're now looking at the second generation. Okay. And they find that the effect is higher even for second generation of women. They also benefited. Okay. So it's not that first generation of women benefited, then everybody realized, oh no, if we die without a will, the land will go to daughters. So everybody is writing a will and the daughters do not benefit anymore. So that's not the case. There is an increase, right? But it's weaker effect. Okay. This is looking at age at marriage. Does the fact that now daughters inherit land change when parents marry them? So what do you see here? There is, if the father died before the amendment, obviously there is no, and the daughter was married after the amendment, there is no change in her age at marriage. But if the father was alive when the law was passed, and he either remained alive when the survey was taken, or he died afterwards, that means this daughter was more likely to inherit land. We see that her age at marriage goes up. Okay, so this is saying that making the daughter wealthier somehow increases maybe her bargaining power, because now her father may have died, or she's going to basically inherit land. So she may have a greater say in what her future is, and this may increase her age at marriage. Right? She may benefit from it, or maybe because she now gets more educated, and if you're getting more educated, you postpone your age at marriage. Right? So there seems to be some evidence that it affected age at marriage. And if so, this should affect Hindus more than non-Hindus. Okay, so I think that table is not here, but it should be in the paper. What about educational attainment? Again, what you see is that educational attainment went up for Hindu girls who were very young when this reform was passed. Okay, it did not change for Hindu boys, it did not change for non-Hindu girls. But the reforms increased daughters' educational attainment. Okay, so they not only, if you were older, you inherited land. If you were younger, you were given more education, and also you were married later. Okay, so this paper sort of argues that giving women more inheritance rights increases women's bargaining power and increases their educational attainment, increases their age at marriage, and all that is a good thing for them. Okay, there's another paper which tries to do the same thing but in a slightly different way, and they find slightly different results. So this is Shantari Roy. who is looking at women who were affected by the same reform, but she looks at women who are at least 22 years of age at the time of survey. Okay, and some of them were school going age when the reform was passed, and some of them were not. Okay, and who is the school going age? Anyone who is 10 years or younger, because in India women do not go to school for a long time. A lot of them drop out. So she looks at under 10 girls when the reform was passed. What does she find? So she does a similar identification strategy. Let's see what she finds. So remember, the earlier paper found increases in years of education if a girl was likely to benefit from the inheritance right reform. She also finds the same, right? So let's look at this. This is years of education. If a girl was 5 years or less at the time of reform in her state, there was an increase at least of about half a year of education. Now, this may look small, but you know, average educational attainment for women in India is very low, right? It's like maybe 7-8 years or something like that. So this is a much, in percentage terms, it's a huge increase. If you were 6 to 10 years old, you still see that effect. Okay, but if you're 11 to 15, then you don't see, because by that time girls probably are already pulled out of school, so there isn't much of an impact. So younger girls benefited more from education due to the reform than older girls, and that is similar to what the previous paper found. Okay, she does it in the same way and she finds similar results, and she finds that the effect on education was larger for households that own land, right? So if you were a landless household, how should it matter whether there is an inheritance reform? Because landless, most of the inheritance in India is land, and if there is no land, then really shouldn't matter, right? So she does find that the effect is larger for households that own land. These are the households that don't own land in the top few, and you don't see much significant effect. Okay, so that's consistent with the inheritance brands affecting education. But this is a different channel. What she finds is, if you were a landowning household and the daughter is younger when this happens, so these are the age 10 or less daughters who are increasing education, their dowry goes down. Okay, but that's not the case for older women. So what you see is that parents are now, so what is dowry, right? Dowry for a long time was thought of as a pre-mortem bequest. Because inheritance rights were biased in favor of boys, so if women did not inherit property, what parents did instead was, we are going to give our daughter dowry, that's her share, and the son will get the land, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Now that the daughter is getting land as well, one would think, if that's what parents were doing before, now will they say, okay, our daughter earlier we would have given her dowry because she was not getting land, now we are going to give her less dowry because she's getting some land, right? You see some of that happening here. Also, these parents are now increasing education investment in their daughter. So they're saying, not only are we educating the daughter more, we are also giving her land, we are going to give her less dowry. You see something like that going on, right? So the inheritance right increases education and increases land inheritance, but it decreases dowry. Whereas for older girls who were now not benefiting from education because they were already old enough, for them, you continue to give dowry. Okay. So, but the basic point is that inheritance rights can have impacts which are not so straightforward, right? So it's one thing to say, let's do the inheritance right equalization and everything is fine. But that's clearly not how things go, right? Just because you change one law, first of all, doesn't mean it will get implemented. And second, it can have different impacts in different groups, right? You can see effects not just in the inheritance dimension, but it can have an impact on dowry, it can have an impact on education, it can have an impact on age at marriage, and so on. And to have a better understanding of whether the law is successful or not, one has to look at all these dimensions. Okay, that's, I think, the general point I'm trying to make here. Okay, so if you're interested, there is more work on it. In fact, in your reading list, there's a paper which looks at the effect of inheritance on sex ratios. Because remember, one way daughters' education can get affected is because the mothers are now have land, right? So if I'm the first generation, I get land from my father, my daughter's outcomes may be better because now I have more property, right? I have a better bargaining power vis-a-vis my husband, so my daughter benefits from that. So my daughter has a higher education, my daughter has a higher age at marriage. I'm less likely to have a sex selective abortion because now I have more bargaining power because I benefit from my father's property. Okay, so these effects can be on multi-generation, and that could be another channel. Okay, all right. So the last sort of paper is in the women's labor market channel. So we all know that female labor force participation is a big topic in the gender space in India. This is a slightly older paper from 2012, and it's not directly about the current situation, but this is very important as we'll see. So let's think of women. So we know there are low labor market opportunities for women. Why is that? Right? Is it because the opportunity, so it means that the opportunity cost of education, low education, marrying a woman early is pretty low, right? Because if I think there isn't a job for my daughter, there is really not much I'm missing out on if I educate her less or marry her off early. But if labor market opportunities for women go up, does that affect women's education, early marriage, or child rearing? Right? So this is another way of asking a question, a different question, which is that is age at marriage low? Is education low because there is no labor market opportunity for women? Are people marrying their daughters early because women do not work in the labor force? Right? And this paper tries to answer that question and finds that the answer is yes. So how do they do that? So the population is rural India. In fact, this is parts of Haryana around Delhi. And in this population, when the paper was done, median age at marriage was 17, median age at first birth was 19, completed fertility was about 4.3 children, and only 20% of women worked in the labor force, okay, in a paid capacity. So the experiment was about the BPO sector. So this is the time period when BPO sector was just starting out in India. Okay, I mean, not now, this is like early years of BPO sector. And it was a pretty new industry at that point. And all of us know that the BPO sector was really good for increasing female participation, right? A lot of jobs in the BPO sector were female. And in fact, it's much more female in terms of its employment than other sectors. But rural areas really did not know much about the BPO jobs. It was more concentrated in urban or peri-urban areas, but not in rural areas. So what this experiment did was, this paper has a randomized experiment. It increased awareness about these jobs, okay, and helped women become better at applying for these jobs. So they didn't go and give them the job. All the experiment did was told them, look, there are these jobs, and if you want, you can, this is how you can create the CV and so on. Okay? And the people they selected for this experiment were in rural areas around Delhi, where BPO people also did not go. So this is, we are not talking about Gurgaon, right? Gurgaon is, obviously not rural anymore, and it's not the, where BPO recruiters don't go. It was more sort of interior Haryana. And they selected villages which were 50 to 150 kilometers from Delhi. So not so far. It's not like 1,000 kilometers that it doesn't have any impact, but something still far away that they could not have known on their own. And then they picked 80 villages for the treatment group, 80 villages for the control group, and that's about it. And now for villages that were randomly selected for the treatment, they assigned 8 BPO recruiters to those villages. Okay, so these are people who recruit people for BPOs. So what was the experiment? So what they did was, in 2004, they went to these villages and set up an information and recruitment session. So they went to maybe a village, some sort of common area, town hall type of thing. And they said, we have this information session, you can come and learn about stuff. Okay, so they gave people an overview of what the sector is, what type of jobs are available, what will be the salary, which firms are looking for jobs, looking for workers, how can you apply? So they told them, how can you create your resume? They gave them a list of websites, phone numbers, provided them information on interview skills, did mock interviews, assessment of English language skills, and so on, and a question answer session. So generally what you think of, these sort of job fairs do. And they told them that, look, these jobs are not easy to get, they're competitive. So the BPO, they were not giving them guarantee that they will get a job. They were simply telling them, these are available, we can help you with your resume, but rest is up to you. And this was only done for women. So they did not benefit men in those sessions, right? Of course, if I went to this session, I could have gone home and told my brother about it, told my father about it, right? But it is not that my brother or my father could go to this session. Only women were allowed. Okay. And they were also told that the job opportunities are mainly for women who have a secondary school degree and preferably have some English knowledge and have some experience with computers, right? Now it's possible that, even though these sessions were not done in the control villages, maybe I have a cousin who lives in the control village and I told the cousin about it. And the cousin also therefore was treated, right? So those sort of things can happen, but they basically did not go to the control villages, and there's only as much contamination as possible. Okay. And then they did this for 2 years. So they went once, then after a year they went again, after 2 years they went again. So they basically for 3 years, they gave 3 in-depth sessions, and 3 years of people had support in terms of resumes. They told them about which jobs are available and so on. Okay. And if you needed some ongoing support, they gave them, recruiter's address or phone number, you could contact them. Okay. And these sort of jobs, as we know, were probably less stigmatized than, going and working in a factory and so on. Okay. So this is just some information on the BPO sector at that time. So 45% of the women in those call centers were women, which is much higher than other sectors, and they paid relatively well. Okay. And also salaries increased quite quickly. So the returns from education were going up. They paid twice the amount of average pay as non-BPO jobs for the same level of education. Okay, so there was an increase in demand for female educated workers, and there was an increase in returns from education than before. Okay. This is just a balance table. So when they did the experiment at baseline, the treatment and control villages looked very different, similar. There were no differences. Okay, so these are the differences, and they are not statistically significant except for one small one here. Okay, good. What happened afterwards? So they are now looking at the effect on round 2, okay, on employment. This is for women, panel A, panel B is for men. The coefficient of treatment tells you the effect on treatment group relative to control group. And they do this for different age groups. So for 18 to 24-year-old women, they were 5 percentage points more likely to work in BPO employment than similar women in control villages. So that means this information session increased the likelihood of BPO employment for 18 to 24-year-old girls in treatment villages. There was no such effect for men in this age group. Okay. If you look at 25 to 44-year-old women, nothing happened. Nothing, obviously, for 45 to 60-year-old women, right? That means the intervention worked primarily for these younger girls who were probably not married at that time, okay? But not for slightly older girls. This also means they were more likely to work for pay away from home. So remember, just because the intervention was telling them information about BPO jobs, doesn't mean they have to work in the BPO sector. They learned about jobs, they learned about how to make a CV, they learned about how to give interviews, where to find job openings. So maybe they also apply to other industries, and that can show you that there was an increase in general, right? But most of the increase was in the BPO sector. So that's the first effect. So 900 women from the treatment villages got BPO jobs over the 3-year period. Of course, not everyone was qualified. Only 28% of women had enough schooling that they could qualify. Okay, but 900 was the benefit from the treatment. So the treatment worked in increasing women's employment. What happened to other things, right? So typically, they ask the control group women, do you expect to work for pay away from home before you get married? 30% said yes. After marriage, but before children, less, 19%. When children are still young, even less, so only 4% wanted to work. And after children have left, then it goes up again. Okay. So basically, this is very typical of the female labor force participation rate in India. It is higher before marriage, goes down after marriage, goes down even more after birth of children, and then tries to go up later when the children are older. Okay. What happened in treatment group? You see that the difference, there was an increase in the likelihood of working before marriage in the treatment group women, right? So it went up by 13% in fact. It also increased after marriage, but before children, but no effect after having children. That means the intervention was not able to increase women's employment once they had children, but it had an effect before they had children and before they had married. Okay? And it also increased for women who, and again, this is expectation. This is not whether they actually did, but women who received the treatment thought that they will be more likely to work after their children had left school and are married, right? They also thought they would be more likely to work before having children, but they did not think that this would help them work after marriage when they have children. Okay. What about girls who were not old enough to benefit from the intervention? So what if I have a daughter who's 6 years old, who's still going to school, just started going to school, and in my village, these people have come and they're giving all this information. So maybe my wife went, maybe my older daughter went, and I have a younger daughter who's not yet beneficial. What this paper finds is that women who are younger also benefit. Okay, so these are 18 to 24-year-old women who can directly benefit. What we see is that they're more likely to enroll in a training, right? So what is the training? These could be vocational institutes. They could go for a coaching class for English. They could go for a coaching class for computers. What they find is that there is a 3 percentage point increase in training enrollment for these older girls. But if you look at younger girls who are not that old, who do not benefit from the BPO job right now, they are more likely to be enrolled in school, right? So this means that parents are being forward-looking. They have now learned about these jobs that their daughters can do when they're older, and they're taking that information into account and sending their younger girls to school more. Okay? So this tells you that parents don't send girls to school not just because they don't care about girls, but because they think that there is maybe less return to education for girls. But now when they learn that there is a higher return to education for girls, they do respond, right? It's not that there is a 100% increase, but at least there is a 5% increase once parents have learned about it. Okay? They're also investing more in their daughter's health. So BMI of these younger girls improves, right? Which means that parents are putting more investments in their girls in terms of their weight, right? They're eating better, their health is improving, right? Height obviously is a long-term indicator, so it doesn't change. And again, nothing happens for boys. Okay, so this again tells you that this is the intervention that is having an impact, not something else. Okay, what happens to the age of marriage and fertility of these older girls? So girls that were old enough, this 18 to 24-year-old, that's precisely the age when they get married and have children, right? And now you have this BPO sector, which we know has increased their employment. We see that it reduces their likelihood of being married at a point. That means its age at marriage is going up, right? So they're 5% less likely to be married at the time of survey. They're also therefore less likely to have a child, because in India, childbearing is tied to marriage, right? So if they're less likely to be married at that point, they're less likely to have children, and their desired fertility has gone down. So if you ask them how many children would you like to have, they want to now have fewer children. Why? Because they know they can work. And if the more children they have, the longer it will be that they will stay at home, right? So they now want to have fewer children so that once their children are older, they can go back to work. Okay? Nothing for men, again, which is what we would expect, right? So what this is telling us is this increase in labor force possibility, just the information, is affecting employment rate, affecting marriage age, affecting fertility, affecting desired fertility, and for younger girls, affecting their education and health, because parents are making investments in their daughters, taking into account that their future labor market opportunities have gone up, right? So this tells us that first of all, parents are not idiots. They are responding to actual changes in the opportunities, and they are not just discriminating against their daughters. At least some of it is because of what they think is the return on that investment. And second, if you affect labor market opportunities for women, it can have effects on other things like their marriage rates, their fertility rates, and so on, right? So labor market opportunities do matter a lot. Okay, this is just some, we can ignore that. This can also be ignored. Okay, so the conclusion is human capital investment in girls responds to labor market opportunities. It can also affect marriage and childbearing, and it can also increase career aspirations, right? Notice the intervention did not create more jobs. They did not go and bring the BPO sector into India. They did not increase the number of supply or demand for jobs. They simply told these women about the jobs that already existed. Okay, so this tells us that maybe one policy that we can have is, increase access to what already exists. Maybe many women don't know about them. Maybe many parents don't know about these job opportunities, and they think there are no job opportunities. So I remember at some point in the last lecture, somebody had said that, one reason why there is low labor force participation is because there are no opportunities. It's possible in many places there isn't, but maybe also there are, but we just don't know about them. Right? And maybe one thing that the government can do is increase awareness about what types of jobs women can do. Increase awareness about that. If the parents are not educated, they may not know what is available and what is not available. Right? So that's one policy intervention.